Hey, welcome on in, everybody. Tobin here with you. Thanks for checking us on out. And if you guys could subscribe to the channel, that'd mean a lot to me. Subscribe to the Tobin and Leroy show, the podcast form. That'd be great. And if you could also, the 560 WQAM YouTube page. We go live every single weekday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Looking forward to some shenanigans this week. I felt bad. I did not recap the last Heat game. First one that I have not recapped, I think, all year, but tough weekend for me. I'll get more into that at another time. But it was it doesn't look like I missed much with that game. It looked like the Pacers with no Tyrese Halliburton lighting the Heat's ass up for, I believe they scored, was it 78? 78 was their field goal percentage in the second half of that game. It was a pretty brutal affair watching it back on the highlights. I think the first game I hadn't watched live all year, and it was a rough one for Miami. They just could not stop this Indiana Pacers team that, has just been scoring at a crazy rate. An absolute bananas rate all season long. We saw a little bit of this, of course, with the first game. Miami was able to hang, and in this one, it was a lot of Jimmy Butler and not much else. And I really didn't want to get into the game because, hey, it's past it. We're a couple days past it. The Heat are going to be off today, and they'll be back. I would imagine they're going to practice in tomorrow before heading to Toronto. On the injury front with that, Jimmy Butler has got some interesting comments to get to. But on the injury front with the Heat, Bam Adebayo is going to miss this game. I'd imagine Haywood Highsmith, there's a chance he can miss it after he got banged up. Jay Rich got banged up in the last game. We know Tyler Hero. I'm curious to wonder what the update is going to be on him, because maybe we'll get our true update on Tyler and if he's anywhere near a comeback for the Miami Heat. There was some photos this week. I know he was working out this weekend with Udonis Haslem and one of the Heat's strength conditioning coach. So, seems like he's on the mend and seems like he's on his way back. But I wanted to get to these comments from Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler was asked after the Pacers game to assess the Miami Heat after 20 games. Miami Heat getting to this point right now this year, they are 11-9, which is fine. We know that the Miami Heat have definitely dealt with some adversity to be where they're at right now. They are 11-9. They split this against the Indiana Pacers. They're currently out of the top six, but barely. It was just a week ago. It felt like they were creeping. They were right back in the top three. Then they suffered a 3-game losing streak, had that big win against the Pacers. Now they lose again. So it hasn't been a great couple of weeks for Miami as far as the record's concerned. Basically, since they dropped that Knicks game, it has been a bit of a struggle. I mean, there's been some really, the Milwaukee game was a great game. We know that they lost Jimmy in that one, so there was no Jimmy for that game. There's been, Bam was missing for half of the Pacers game. He missed all of this Pacers game. We know that the Brooklyn game, basically everybody was hurt. So look, Miami's been dealing with stuff. They've been dealing with stuff. Bam and this hip has been a real problem basically since the fourth quarter of the Knicks game, where he's really been laboring with it. And I do think that it's smart for the Heat to do what they can to make sure he's all the way back. Because this is one thing that's, Bam, outside of the thumb injury a couple of years back where he missed an extended period of time, this is not something, they are not used to life without Bam Adebayo. And Bam doesn't typically get these banged up injuries where it's like it lingers a lot. Maybe like a knee that he had, and I think that was actually one of the things that came from the thumb injuries, that he had a bad knee injury and that he was able to rest both of those out. And obviously Miami went on to be the 1 seed that season. But this is something that they got to be really careful with, I think, with him, especially this feels like it's basically been lingering all season. So maybe this is the time to make sure that he is all the way back. So there's that to worry about. There's Tyler, obviously. We don't know when he's going to be coming back. And some other bumps and bruises along the way. But I want to get to these comments from Jimmy Butler. So Jimmy was asked to give an assessment on the Miami Heat season after 20 games. And I think Jimmy's usually a very glass half full kind of guy. It's usually like, we're going to, be there at the end. We'll be there at the end. We will be there standing with the trophy and taking a shot right now. But I thought it was a very honest assessment from Jimmy Butler, especially considering there are a lot of outs and there's a lot of places that the Heat could go. And this is probably a couple of times. I remember the last one of the games that I went to when they dropped to 1-4. Jimmy was not. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, Jimmy doesn't care about the regular season." But at 1-4, Jimmy Butler's like, "No, there's urgency right now." And I thought that Jimmy Butler coming out and saying this about his team said a little something about where he thinks the team is at. And if there is any concern right now, here was Jimmy.
We stand right where we don't want to be, which is very mediocre. Not good, not bad, not great, not any of those things. Just mediocre. When you talk about our offense, it's been mediocre. You talk about our defense, it's been mediocre. So that's the word that I would use.
So that's the word he was used. He would describe everything right now as mediocre, which I don't think is an unfair criticism of Miami. I think if you were to look at this year and talk about this team, there's been some good things. I think that if we were to assess what are the highlights so far of this Heat season, one of them would be the season that Bam Adebayo is having, and he has been absolutely great. I think personally for Jimmy, we have seen him really crank it up, especially these last couple of games against the Pacers. He's looked more like Jimmy Butler than any part of this season. It's definitely been more noticeable over the last couple of weeks that Jimmy does feel like he is starting to crank things up a little bit, but he is also had his stupid ankle tweak here and there and has had his injuries that he's had to deal with, and of course got off to a really rocky start this season. The Heat have just not been able to get on that track where, especially with Bam and Jimmy together, they can just kind of go forth. And then I think if we're going to talk about what else has been excellent so far for the Heat this season, I mean, obviously you would look to Jaime Jaquez Jr., and he has been basically probably the best part to tune in and night out and see. And even he had probably one of his quieter nights this past Saturday. But yeah, I don't think it's an unfair criticism for Jimmy to say that. They've been here, and you think about where they were in that Bucks game. It's like, man, they had such a great effort against Milwaukee, and they brought it down to the wire. And bam, he played like an absolute stud. But you didn't have Jimmy, and it's like, well. You could always look to that and you could say, well, this is where we are. We have this. But I do think that there's a couple of things. One, the Heat have been very used to this in Jimmy Butler's time. They've always seemingly been missing a key piece, whether it be him or Lowry or Tyler or Bam. There's been an element that's usually missing to them. It did feel like things were going in the right direction. They were getting healthier and they were getting deeper. Caleb Martin certainly looks like he's rounding back into form, which is great news for Miami. The backup, big spot like Orlando Robinson has definitely been bringing some more, and it feels like he is, maybe taking that backup big spot, especially of nights that Kevin Love is having a little bit of a rough go of it. And I think Kyle's been pretty decent for Miami. Kyle Lowry has had a nice season for the Heat. It's not one of those where I think the Heat fan can really sit back and complain about it. He is 37. You got to put your expectations are where they are with them. But it is interesting how you come off of this win against the Pacers and you have this great offensive performance. And you come back and you put up 142 points and you're just like, see, we can score with anybody. We can score with the best of them. And then you have this performance like you do. And I think it's just one of these things where, like, look, that's a crazy team to play. They're putting up insane numbers from an offensive standpoint. But that's also one of the things I think the Heat pride themselves on. And with no Tyrese Halliburton, Spo had said, like, we let up. That's a strange thing for him to, admit, because he usually, like, never likes to put it out there. Oh, we're going to have the letdown. Like, no, we're always going to try and give everybody our best haymaker, even though that's, not true. They don't all the time. But I found it, for Jimmy to put it out there like that, just so blatant and not wrong, that things have been mediocre. I think that there's been really high moments for the season. There's been lulls. I don't think anything has been quite as low as them being 1-4. I think since that point and them sweeping the road trip, that, from that point on, I think things have felt like, you can see the good in this team, and you can see that they can still beat anybody and hang with anybody. But there have been lapses, and I think that you think back to, the collapse that especially these just defensive droughts that they go on, where they're just letting teams cook. You think back to the Knicks game, you think back to blowing it against the Bulls, you think this past game where they just could not stop Indiana at all. These are ones where you're just like, maybe they're just not quite there all the way locked in. And again, you have to put I'm putting all of this with the halo of I know that they have not been healthy yet, but I'm just talking about for the guys that are out there where the execution seems to be lacking and why their record isn't better, because, now they have lost 4 out of their last 5. And, they got to go to Toronto this upcoming week. They do get a little bit of time off, which is great, but Bam is not going to be traveling with them. So the earliest we'll see Bam back out there, I believe, will be Friday, when Cleveland comes to town. And then they got a week where they should really fatten things up. I mean, they got 2 against Charlotte, 2 against Chicago, who, are not good, and they should try and do their best to go about there and fatten up the record as best as possible and get things right. But even with this week, you're taking on a Toronto team that has not been the greatest thing on earth. They're usually where they are, which is like right under 500. And then we've seen Miami handle Cleveland already. So while, yes, the Pacers have shown themselves to be an offensive juggernaut and can be tough to keep up with because they just seem like they got scoring all over the place, you'd like to at least get through this week splitting it, knowing that you are banged up and not going to have Bam for at least one of these games. But how Miami really gets to that point of being better than mediocre, I mean, I don't know if there is a better answer than they just got to get healthy, and they need a run together where Jimmy, Bam, and Tyler are all out there. I know that this has been thrown out where it's like, oh, the team better than Tyler, are they better without Tyler? Like, well, they're not. Like, let's not act like they're the 1 seed. They had a good run without Tyler when Tyler first got hurt, and now we've kind of seen where, man, they could really use the force that he brings offensively to this team, and then add it on top of what you have seemingly uncovered here with Jaime Jaquez Jr. Because, yeah, I would say outside of Jaquez and Bam, that everybody else has been pretty mediocre. They've had their ups, everybody's had their kind of moments, but also there's been some. Duncan, I would say probably too. Duncan's for the most part been pretty excellent this year, but Caleb, Kyle, Kevin, even Jimmy, I think have not been at their best for a consistent part of the year quite yet.